the Soviet capital looked like the command center of a new civilization. Electric light cut through the snow, tram cables hummed, and banners promised a future that would outpace and outlast the capitalist world. But beneath the slogans, the USSR under Joseph Stalin was a state built on a specific bargain: rapid transformation at any cost, enforced by a party that claimed to speak for history itself. To understand what life under Stalin was really like, you have to hold two realities in your head at once. The Soviet Union did industrialize at a speed that stunned foreign observers. It did defeat Nazi Germany at a catastrophic human cost. It did create a social order that offered education and upward mobility for millions who had been peasants only a decade earlier. And it did all of that through coercion on a scale that turned everyday life into a landscape of fear, ration lines, denunciations, prisons, and mass death. The Stalin era wasn't simply hard times or a dictatorship. It was a system where the state tried to reorganize society down to the last village and apartment corridor, and where politics became a matter of survival. Stalin did not appear out of nowhere. The world he inherited was already brutalized by war and revolution. The Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, followed by civil war from 1918 to 1921, foreign interventions, famine, and the creation of a one-party state. Vladimir Lenin's government had already used secret police powers through the Cheka, created in 1917, and had already normalized political repression and censorship. By the time Lenin died in January 1924, the Soviet Union was exhausted, but it was also stabilizing under the new economic policy, the NEP, which allowed limited private trade and small-scale capitalism. Stalin, born Iosif Jugashvili in 1878 in Gori, Georgia, was not the most famous revolutionary, but he was a master of the party machine. As General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1922, he controlled appointments, promotions, and access, building a network of loyalists. The struggle for power after Lenin's death was not one dramatic coup. It was a series of bureaucratic victories. Stalin outmaneuvered Leon Trotsky, then allied with and later destroyed Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, and finally turned on Nikolai Bukharin and the so-called right opposition. By 1929, Stalin had consolidated personal dominance, and with that dominance came a radical shift in policy that would remake daily life for nearly every Soviet citizen. The key decision was to abandon the NEP and force a leap into heavy industrialization and collectivized agriculture. The official logic was geopolitical and ideological. The USSR was surrounded by hostile capitalist powers, technologically backward and vulnerable. Stalin famously framed the urgency in a speech in February 1931, warning that the Soviet Union was 50 to 100 years behind advanced countries and must close the gap in a decade or be crushed. The result was the first five-year plan, launched in 1928, focused on steel, coal, machinery, and electrification. Cities like Magnitogorsk in the Urals became symbols of the new Soviet world, built rapidly near iron ore deposits, with blast furnaces rising from mud and snow. Dniprostroi, the Dnieper hydroelectric station, began construction in 1927 and became one of the largest dams in Europe when completed in 1932, a monument to the regime's obsession with scale. Foreign engineers and firms were involved. Albert Kahn's company helped design industrial plants, and American and German specialists worked on projects while Soviet propaganda presented it as purely socialist achievement. For workers, the industrial drive meant long hours, dangerous conditions, and relentless quotas. It also meant opportunity. Peasants could become skilled laborers, technicians, and foremen. Young people could enter technical schools. Women were pulled into industrial work in greater numbers. Yet that promise was inseparable from coercion. Labor discipline tightened. Internal passports, introduced in December 1932 for urban residents, restricted movement and tied people to workplaces and cities, while many peasants were excluded from passports and effectively trapped in the countryside. The transformation of agriculture was even more violent. Collectivization, formally pushed at scale from late 1929, aimed to eliminate private peasant farming and create collective farms, kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes. The state wanted grain to feed cities and to export for foreign currency to buy machinery. It also wanted political control over the countryside, where the Bolsheviks had always been weak. Stalin framed the campaign as a class war against the kulaks, a term that once meant wealthier peasants but quickly became a flexible label for anyone resisting. In December 1929, Stalin announced the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. What that meant in practice was mass confiscation of property, deportations, and executions. Families were loaded onto trains and sent to special settlements in Siberia, the Urals, Kazakhstan, and the far north. The numbers were immense. Historians estimate that roughly 1.8 to 2 million people were deported as kulaks and their families in 1931-931 alone, with high mortality from cold, hunger, and disease. In villages, collectivization smashed the rhythms of life. Livestock was slaughtered by peasants who preferred to kill their animals rather than surrender them. The Soviet livestock herd collapsed in the early 1930s, undermining food supply for years. The immediate consequence was famine, and not a vague famine of bad harvests, but a catastrophe shaped by policy. In 1932 and 1933, famine struck major grain-producing regions, especially Ukraine, the North Caucasus, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan. The state maintained grain procurements even as villages starved. In Ukraine, the famine is widely known as the Holodomor. In Kazakhstan, forced settlement and collectivization devastated nomadic life, producing a famine that killed a massive share of Kazakhs. The death toll across the USSR is debated by scholars, but millions died. In Ukraine alone, estimates commonly range around 3 to 4 million deaths. Across the Soviet Union, totals often cited are around 5 to 7 million for the 1930-1933 famine, including Kazakhstan. Documented policies worsened the disaster. Blacklisting of villages, confiscation of foodstuffs, restrictions on movement that prevented starving peasants from seeking bread in cities, and punitive laws like the August 7, 1932, decree nicknamed the Law of 5 Ears of Corn, which imposed severe penalties, even execution, for stealing socialist property, including gleaning grain from fields. In January 1933, Stalin and the party leadership issued directives that effectively sealed borders of Ukraine and the Cuban region to prevent mass flight. In village after village, life narrowed to the search for food, the fear of requisition brigades, and the quiet disappearance of neighbors. And yet, even during famine, Soviet propaganda insisted on triumph. Newspapers celebrated record outputs and heroic labor. The state launched the Stakhanovite movement after August 1935, when miner Alexei Stakhanov was credited with extracting an extraordinary amount of coal in a single shift in Donbass. The story, heavily stage-managed, was used to demand higher productivity across industry. For some workers, Stakhanovism brought promotions, better rations, and prestige. For many others, it meant intensified norms, resentment, and workplace conflict. Daily life under Stalin was structured by scarcity and privilege. The ration system, introduced in different forms, made access to food dependent on one's position. Party officials, managers, and specialists could access special stores and better supplies. Ordinary workers stood in lines. The Soviet city became a place where rumor was currency, which shop had bread, which factory had boots, which official could secure a room. Housing was a crisis that never ended. Rapid urbanization overwhelmed infrastructure. Millions moved from villages to industrial centers. Many lived in barracks, dormitories, or overcrowded apartments. The communal apartment, the kommunalka, became a defining feature of urban Soviet life. Families lived in one room, sharing kitchens and bathrooms with strangers, with thin walls and no privacy. The communal corridor was not just a social space, it was a political space. Conversations could be overheard. Visitors were noticed. A careless joke about Stalin, a complaint about shortages, or a remark about arrests could become evidence. Under Stalin, fear was not only a product of secret police raids at night, it was built into the architecture of everyday life. The secret police itself evolved into a state within a state. The Cheka became the GPU, then the OGPU, and in 1934 it was incorporated into the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. The NKVD controlled regular policing, border troops, internal security, and the expanding system of forced labor camps. Stalin's USSR was a surveillance state not because it had modern technology, but because it mobilized people. Informants were recruited in factories, schools, and apartment blocks. Denunciations letters accusing someone of sabotage, counter-revolutionary talk, or hidden wealth-flooded offices. Some denunciations were motivated by ideology, others by personal grudges, workplace rivalries, or the desire to obtain a room or a job. The system encouraged it. The party taught citizens to see enemies everywhere: wreckers who sabotaged production, spies who served foreign powers, Trotskyists plotting revenge, bourgeois nationalists undermining unity. If you lived under Stalin, you learned to speak in safe phrases, to avoid political opinions in public, and to treat the state's version of reality as something you repeated regardless of what you privately believed. The 1930s were also a decade of show trials and public theater. The regime used courts not primarily to determine guilt, but to demonstrate power and shape perception. In 1928, the Shakhty trial targeted engineers accused of sabotage, signaling a campaign against bourgeois specialists. In 1930, the Industrial Party trial and other cases followed, presenting alleged conspiracies of experts working with foreign intelligence. These trials helped Stalin justify purges and central control, and they taught society that failure was not a systemic problem, but the work of hidden enemies. When targets were engineers, managers, and economists, ordinary people could interpret shortages and accidents as sabotage, not as the predictable result of unrealistic plans. The state was training the population to accept that punishment, not reform, was the answer. Then came the turning point that opened the floodgates of mass terror: the assassination of Sergei Kirov. Kirov, the party boss of Leningrad and a member of the Politburo, was shot on December 1, 1934, inside the Smolny Institute. The circumstances remain debated, but the political consequences were immediate and clear. Stalin used the murder to justify sweeping repression. On the same day, a decree expedited investigations and executions in terrorist cases. The Kirov affair became the pretext for arrests across the party and society. It also marked the beginning of the Great Terror, the period of intense mass repression that peaked in 1937 and 1938. The Great Terror was not a single purge of elites, it was a nationwide operation. The leadership framed it as a necessary cleansing, but it functioned as a mechanism of control through fear. The show trials in Moscow became the public face. In August 1936, the first Moscow trial convicted Zinoviev, Kamenev, and others of belonging to a Trotskyite Zinovievite terrorist center. They were executed. In January 1937, the second trial targeted figures like Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov. In March 1938, the third trial included Bukharin and former NKVD chief Genrik Yagoda, among others, accused of absurdly broad conspiracies involving foreign intelligence and plans to dismember the USSR. Confessions were extracted through pressure, threats, and torture. The trials were broadcast in the press, and the population was expected to participate in ritual condemnation. The message was that no revolutionary credentials could protect you. Yesterday's heroes could become today's traitors overnight. But the terror reached far beyond famous names. In July 1937, NKVD Order No. 447 launched mass operations against former kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements. It set quotas for arrests and executions by region. Quotas were not ceilings. Local officials often requested increases. Another operation, NKVD Order No. 485 in August 1937, targeted Poles in the USSR, accusing them of belonging to a Polish military organization. Similar national operations targeted Germans, Latvians, Finns, Greeks, Koreans, and others. The logic was paranoid and geopolitical. The USSR expected war, and Stalin's regime equated ethnic ties with potential treason. The results were devastating. During 1937-1938, the NKVD arrested roughly 1.5 million people. Around 680,000 were executed, according to archival data released after the Soviet period. Millions more were sent to labor camps. The Gulagen acronym for the main administration of camps expanded dramatically. Prisoners built canals, mined gold in Colomar, cut timber in the Taiga, and constructed industrial infrastructure. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, built largely by forced labor and completed in 1933, became an early propaganda showcase, even as it was constructed with immense suffering and high death rates. Under Stalin, forced labor was not a marginal feature. It was integrated into the economy and the politics of punishment. For ordinary people, the terror changed the texture of time. The knock at the door at night became a cultural memory because it was real. Arrests often happened after midnight. The NKVD would search the apartment, confiscate letters and books, and take the accused away. Families were left in limbo, sometimes for years, not knowing whether the person was alive. Wives of traitors could be arrested under policies that treated family members as suspect. Children could be stigmatized, expelled from school, or sent to orphanages. People learned to destroy old correspondence, to remove photographs of purged individuals, to rewrite personal histories. The Soviet citizen under Stalin was forced to become an editor of their own life, constantly adjusting the past to match the present political line. The terror also gutted institutions. The Red Army suffered a devastating purge. In 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and other senior commanders were arrested, tried, and executed, accused of conspiracy. Thousands of officers were dismissed, imprisoned, or shot. The long-term consequence was that the Soviet military entered World War II with weakened leadership and a climate of fear that discouraged initiative. The party itself was transformed. The Bolshevik old guard that had made the revolution was largely destroyed, replaced by a new cadre whose careers depended entirely on Stalin's favor. This was not just personal dictatorship, it was a re-engineering of the ruling class. Loyalty became the primary qualification. Yet life did not stop. Schools taught literacy and technical skills. Soviet culture produced films, novels, and monumental art designed to glorify socialist construction and Stalin himself. Socialist realism became the official artistic doctrine in 1934, demanding optimistic portrayals of Soviet life. The Stalin cult expanded, portraits, statues, and endless praise in newspapers. The 1936 Soviet Constitution proclaimed rights, freedom of speech, assembly, and religion that were meaningless in practice, but powerful as propaganda. Elections were staged. The state needed citizens not only to obey, but to believe, or at least to perform belief. Parades on Red Square, May Day celebrations, and the pageantry of the regime created a sense of participation in something vast. For many, especially those who rose from poverty into education and urban life, the system did deliver a kind of personal ascent. That is part of what made it durable. It combined terror with genuine social mobility for selected groups, and it wrapped both in a narrative of historic mission. Foreign observers saw fragments and drew conflicting conclusions. Some visitors were impressed by industrial projects and the apparent absence of unemployment during the Great Depression. Others reported hunger and fear. Journalists like Gareth Jones reported famine in Ukraine in 1933, while Walter Duranty of the New York Times notoriously downplayed it, reflecting how the Soviet state manipulated access and information. Inside the USSR, information was tightly controlled. The press was an instrument of the party. Radio and cinema were mobilized. Rumors filled the gaps, but rumors could also be dangerous. By the late 1930s, Stalin began to recalibrate. In 1938, Lavrentiy Beria replaced Nikolai Yezhov as head of the NKVD, and the most intense phase of mass operations slowed. Yezhov himself was arrested in 1939 and executed in 1940, a grim reminder that even the architects of terror could be consumed by it. But the system of repression remained. The camps remained. The fear remained. And the international situation was deteriorating rapidly. In Europe, Nazi Germany was expanding. The Soviet Union faced the prospect of war. In August 1939, the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. The public agreement was a non-aggression pact. The secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. On September 17, the Red Army entered eastern Poland. The Soviet state presented this as liberation of Ukrainians and Belarusians, but it was a strategic occupation. In 1940, the USSR annexed the Baltic states Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania after ultimatums and staged political changes, and seized Bessarabia and northern Bukovina from Romania. These moves expanded Soviet territory, but also imported new populations into the Soviet system, including elites who would be targeted for repression. One of the most infamous crimes in this period was the Katyn massacre. In spring 1940, the NKVD executed around 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia in locations including the Katyn forest near Smolensk, as well as Kalinin, Tver, and Kharkiv, following a decision approved by the Soviet leadership. The Soviet Union denied responsibility for decades. The pattern was consistent. Security policy treated entire categories of people as threats to be eliminated. The Winter War against Finland, from November 1939 to March 1940, revealed serious weaknesses in the Red Army, exacerbated by purges. The USSR eventually forced territorial concessions, but at a high cost and with international embarrassment. Still, Stalin believed time could be bought. The calculation collapsed on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, attacking along a vast front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. For Soviet citizens, this was the moment when the terror state confronted an existential enemy and demanded everything. The first months were catastrophic. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Millions of soldiers became prisoners of war, many of whom would die in German captivity. Cities fell. The Nazi occupation brought mass murder, especially of Jews, through Einsatzgruppen shootings and later extermination camps. Soviet civilians faced starvation, forced labor, and terror under occupation. The Siege of Leningrad began in September 1941 and lasted until January 1944, one of the longest and deadliest sieges in modern history. Over 1 million civilians died, mainly from hunger and cold. The Soviet state organized defense and evacuation on a massive scale, moving factories eastward beyond the Urals. The war forced Stalin's system into a different mode, still brutal, still coercive, but now mobilized for national survival. Stalin's leadership during the war combined ruthless discipline with pragmatic concessions. The state appealed to Russian patriotism and historical memory. The Orthodox Church was partially rehabilitated, with the Moscow Patriarchate restored in 1943. The regime relaxed some ideological campaigns to focus on production and morale, but repression did not stop. Order No. 270 in August 1941 treated surrender as treason, stigmatizing POWs and their families. Order No. 227 in July 1942, famous for the phrase, "not one step back," introduced blocking detachments and harsh penalties for retreat without orders. The logic was that fear could substitute for organization when organization had been shattered. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad, culminating in the surrender of the German Sixth Army in February 1943, became a turning point, followed by the Battle of Kursk in summer 1943. The Red Army pushed westward, and by May 1945, it took Berlin. The victory came at a staggering cost. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people, including military and civilian deaths. Entire regions were devastated. Cities lay in ruins. But the triumph also legitimized Stalin's rule in the eyes of many citizens and created a powerful narrative that the state had saved the nation. That narrative would shape Soviet identity for decades. It also allowed Stalin to tighten control again in the post-war period, now over an expanded empire in Eastern Europe. As the Red Army occupied Central and Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes took power in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The process varied by country, but the pattern was consistent. Coalition governments, pressure on opponents, control of security services, and staged elections, culminating in one-party socialist states aligned with Moscow. The Cold War was taking shape. In 1947, The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan signaled the Western strategy of containment. In response, the USSR consolidated its bloc. In 1948, the Berlin blockade tested the post-war order. The USSR also supported communist victories and insurgencies elsewhere, but at home, Stalin returned to internal enemies. Post-war life in the USSR was defined by exhaustion and reconstruction. The Fourth Five-Year Plan began in 1946, focusing on rebuilding industry. Rationing continued until 1947. Housing shortages were severe. Demobilized soldiers returned to destroyed villages and overcrowded cities. Many expected gratitude and a loosening of controls. Instead, Stalin's regime intensified ideological discipline. The ZH Danov's China, named after party leader Andrei Zhdanov, launched campaigns against perceived cosmopolitanism and Western influence in culture and science. Writers, composers, and intellectuals were denounced. In 1948, composers like Dmitri Shostakovich and Sergei Prokofiev were condemned for formalism, pressured to conform to socialist realism. Jewish intellectuals and institutions were increasingly targeted in late Stalinism, culminating in the Anti-Cosmopolitan campaign and the 1952 execution of members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The atmosphere became one of tightening suspicion, with the state portraying foreign contact as contamination. Repression also took the form of mass deportations of entire peoples during and after the war. In 1944, the Soviet state deported the Chechens and Ingush to Central Asia in Operation Lentil, accusing them of collaboration with the Germans. Similar fates struck the Crimean Tatars, deported in May 1944, as well as Karachays, Balkars, and others. Hundreds of thousands were moved in brutal conditions, with significant mortality. These deportations reshaped the ethnic map of regions and left wounds that would re-emerge after the Soviet collapse. The logic was collective guilt, implemented through the NKVD as a tool of demographic engineering. In the late Stalin period, the Gulag remained central. Camps held not only criminals but political prisoners, including those accused of wartime collaboration, nationalists from annexed territories, and even Soviet soldiers who had been captured and later repatriated. The post-war years also saw new waves of arrests in the Baltic states and western Ukraine, where anti-Soviet resistance persisted. Armed insurgency in western Ukraine, associated with the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, continued into the late 1940s and early 1950s, met with brutal counterinsurgency. In the Baltics, partisan, Forest Brothers fought Soviet forces for years. For people in these regions, Stalinism arrived not in 1929, but after 1940 and again after 1944, and it arrived with deportations, collectivization, and the crushing of local political life. Even in the Russian heartland, daily existence remained shaped by state power. The passport system controlled movement, workplaces were politicized, party meetings, trade unions, and youth organizations like the Komsomol were channels for surveillance and advancement. Education expanded, but curricula were ideological. Religion was suppressed, though not eliminated. The state promoted atheism, but in many villages and families, belief persisted quietly. The Soviet citizen learned the difference between the official voice and the private voice, between what could be said at a factory meeting and what could be said in a kitchen with the radio turned up to mask conversation. This duality, public conformity and private caution, became a survival skill. The climax of late Stalin paranoia came with the doctor's plot. In January 1953, Soviet newspapers announced that a group of mostly Jewish doctors had allegedly conspired to poison Soviet leaders. The accusations were fabricated, part of an anti-Semitic campaign that drew on Cold War suspicion and internal power struggles. The atmosphere turned ominous. Arrests and interrogations spread fear among professionals and minorities. Then, on March 5, 1953, Stalin died after suffering a stroke. He was 74. The doctor's plot was soon denounced as false, and the arrested doctors were released. The sudden reversal revealed a central truth about Stalinism. Reality could be rewritten overnight, and a person's fate depended less on evidence than on the current needs of power. What did life under Stalin feel like in the aggregate? It felt like living inside a machine that could produce miracles and catastrophes with the same indifference. For a young worker in the 1930s, it could mean leaving a village, learning to read, becoming a skilled machinist, and feeling pride at contributing to a giant national project. For a peasant family, it could mean losing land and livestock, watching children starve in 1933 and fearing the arrival of requisition squads. For an engineer, it could mean promotion one year and arrest the next, accused of wrecking because a plan failed. For a party member, it could mean reciting loyalty while quietly burning old letters to protect your family. For a soldier, it could mean fighting the Nazis with extraordinary courage while knowing that capture could brand you a traitor. For a minority community, it could mean being labeled a suspect population and placed on a train to exile. Stalinism was not one experience. It was a set of pressures applied unevenly but relentlessly, with the state deciding who would be rewarded and who would be destroyed. The long-term consequences were profound. The Soviet Union emerged from Stalin's rule as a superpower with a vast industrial base and an empire in Eastern Europe, but it also emerged with deep structural damage, an economy distorted by coercion and misinformation, a political culture where truth was dangerous, and a society trained to equate safety with silence. The terror eliminated not only enemies, but competence, initiative, and trust. It created habits that outlived Stalin: the reflex to hide problems from superiors, the tendency to blame saboteurs rather than confront systemic failures, the fear of independent organization. When Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech in February 1956, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and mass repression, it shocked many Soviet citizens not because they had never heard of terror, but because the state was admitting what it had forced them to pretend was not happening. De-Stalinization loosened some controls and released many prisoners, but it did not erase the institutional DNA of the system Stalin built. In the post-Soviet world, Stalin's era remains a battlefield of memory. Some remember industrialization and victory in 1945. Others remember famine, executions, and camps. The archival record, survivor testimony, demographic studies, and documented orders like NKVD 447 make clear that mass repression was not an accident or an exaggeration. It was policy. The lesson is not that the USSR was uniquely evil or that history is a morality play. The lesson is more unsettling. A modern state, armed with ideology and bureaucracy, can normalize extraordinary violence when it convinces enough people that the future requires it, and when fear makes dissent feel suicidal. Life under Stalin was really like that grand projects rising from the earth, and at the same time, people vanishing into the night. The modern consequence is that societies built on enforced unanimity can achieve dramatic mobilization, but they do it by destroying the very human trust and truth-telling that make progress sustainable. The shadow of that bargain still falls across Russia, Eastern Europe, and the wider world whenever power demands silence in exchange for security, and whenever the state insists that history itself has given it the right to decide who gets to live without fear.